In the winter of 1570, the Volkhov River froze with bodies beneath its ice. Men, women and children, chained, stabbed, clubbed, dumped into the black water by a royal decree. Their crime? Living in a city the Tsar no longer trusted. Ivan IV, crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia, ordered the execution of up to 60,000 civilians in Novgorod. Not for rebellion, not for treason, but for suspicion. This is not a story of war. It's the story of a man who became his own plague. In January 30, the city of Novgorod fell silent, not from peace but from suffocation. Snow blanketed its rooftops like a shroud. The bells of St. Sophia no longer rang. The marketplace, once full of voices and trade, stood empty. Behind shuttered doors, families whispered prayers they knew would not be answered. They had seen the smoke first, then the riders, and finally the dogs, those black-cloaked men of the Oprichnina, Tsar Ivan's personal death squad. Dressed like monks but armed like demons. Novgorod had been loyal, prosperous, devout, but it was also envied. Ivan the Terrible had long suspected the city of treason. Rumours, never proven, claimed the archbishop had conspired with Lithuania. That was enough. The Tsar arrived with 100 mounted men and a fury no prayer could calm. For 5 weeks the city was sealed off from the world. The killings were not swift. They were theatrical. Men were dragged from their homes, accused in mock trials, stripped of clothes and dignity. Entire families were tied together, their names read aloud like curses. Infants were thrown into pits before their mothers' eyes. Priests were skinned alive in the public square. And when the blood ran thick in the streets, the river became the final witness. Each morning carts rolled toward the Volkhov. Bodies were loaded, limbs tangled, eyes open, mouths frozen in mid-scream. Soldiers pried apart the ice and threw the corpses in. Some were still breathing. Witnesses said the river groaned for days. The current slowed. The ice turned red. Estimates vary. Some say 15,000 died. Others, closer to the truth, whisper up to 60,000. The real number lies buried with them, under snow and silence. No foreign army had invaded. No rebellion had risen. This was a massacre, ordered from the throne of a man once hailed as divinely anointed. But this was only the beginning. The terror of Ivan Wolfbor, Ivan Grozny, would stretch across decades and thousands of lives. His rage was not blind. It had eyes, names, patterns, and it always found a reason. He did not kill to win. He killed to cleanse, to dominate, to remind Russia who sat at the center of its fear. History would call him the Terrible, but the Russian word Grozny also means formidable, or inspiring, even justified in wrath. So what do we call a ruler who made God seem optional, but made death mandatory? This is not just a chronicle of murders. It's the story of how a boy abandoned in the Kremlin grew into a man who burned cities to feel control. It begins in sundoors, behind palace doors, and ends with rivers choked in corpses. Before he became Ivan the Terrible, he was simply Ivan, a boy with a crown too large for his head and a silence too loud for his soul. He was only 3 years old when his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died from an infected abscess. The throne of Moscow, one of the largest in Europe, was passed to a toddler who barely knew how to speak, let alone rule. Power, however, did not wait. A regency council was formed. Boyars, noble families with old blood and older ambitions, moved into the palace like vultures into a corpse. Each wanted to control the child Tsar. None wanted to raise him, and so Ivan was not raised. He was left to rot in gold. The boy lived in the shadowed halls of the Kremlin, beneath frescoes of saints and chandeliers that never dimmed. His food came cold, his clothes hung loose, his tutors beat him as often as they taught him. No one kissed him good night. No one answered when he screamed in the dark. He watched as the boyars poisoned each other's wine, plotted in whispers, and mocked his family's name. Servants were dismissed, guards changed weekly. The royal treasury was looted by those sworn to protect him. Once he saw a nobleman throw a beggar off a palace wall for sport. No one was punished. The beggar was never mentioned again. At 7, Ivan began to collect animals, cats, dogs, birds. He fed them scraps and spoke to them in a soft voice no one else ever heard. Then one day he threw a dog from the tower window, just to watch how long it would fall. No one stopped him, no one ever would again. At 8, he discovered the royal library. Histories of Byzantium, Rome, and the Orthodox saints. He read of kings chosen by God, of divine punishment, of sacred wrath. The idea seduced him. If God could strike down sinners, why couldn't he? By 10, his mother, Elena Glinskaya, was dead. Rumours said poison administered by the boyars. Ivan never forgot. He began to dream not of peace, but of revenge. Not of building a kingdom, but of owning it. Witnesses at court later wrote of a strange change in him. How his voice deepened suddenly. How his eyes, once wide with fear, narrowed with calculation. How he began speaking of fire, of betrayal, of purging. They laughed at first. He was only a child. Then at 13 Ivan ordered his first execution. He had Prince Andrei Shwisky, one of the most powerful boyars, thrown into a pit of hungry dogs. The man's screams echoed through the Kremlin corridors. Ivan watched, not with glee, but with absolute calm. The boy who had been powerless now understood one thing. Power wasn't given, it had to be taken, and once taken, held like a blade at the throat of everyone else. In the cracks of the Kremlin walls, a new Tsar was forming, not shaped by love, but by humiliation. He was a mirror to the cruelty that raised him, and that mirror would soon be polished with blood. On a cold January day in 1547, Moscow trembled, but not from fear. This time it was from something unfamiliar: hope. At just 17, Ivan IV became the first crowned Tsar of all Russia. Not Grand Prince, not Regent. Tsar from the Roman Caesar. He chose that title himself. It was not inherited, but declared. The coronation was grand, almost sacred. Golden domes shimmered under snowlight. Bells rang through the stone arteries of the city. Crowds chanted prayers, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time, Russia had a ruler who claimed divine authority, not as a servant of nobles, but as a chosen son of God. It was the kind of elevation Ivan had dreamed of in the darkness of the Kremlin halls. He looked magnificent. Robes embroidered with pearls, a beard trimmed in the Byzantine style, eyes sharp but steady. And for a brief, blinding moment, he ruled well. Ivan reformed the laws, modernized the army, and married a woman he truly loved, Anastasia Romanovna, a noble woman of kindness and quiet strength. Their union shocked the court. She was not foreign royalty or political leverage, just his choice. He created the Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly meant to give voice to commoners and some merchants. He cracked down on corruption. He promoted able men from lesser backgrounds instead of spoiled boyars. For a Russia broken by centuries of Mongol invasion and civil war, it felt like rebirth. But cracks, hairline and spreading were already forming beneath the gold. He ruled with purpose, yes, but also with paranoia. He demanded loyalty, but defined betrayal on his own terms, and above all he feared the past repeating itself. Ivan still remembered the cruelty of the boyars, how they humiliated his mother, stole from the treasury and treated him like a puppet child. He smiled in public, but in private he memorized their names. Then came the fire. In June of 1547, just months after his coronation, Moscow burned. A massive fire tore through the wooden city for days. Thousands perished. Entire districts turned to ash. The sky went black and famine soon followed. The people, starving, grieving, blamed his wife's family, the Romanovs. Rumours spread that they had brought witchcraft into the court. Riots exploded. The royal palace was stormed. Ivan and Anastasia barely escaped with their lives. He was shaken, not just by the fire, but by how quickly his people turned. The same lips that kissed icons for his blessing now spat curses in the streets. In the ashes, something inside him cracked. From that moment, Ivan no longer saw himself as a ruler among men, but as a sword in the hand of God. He began praying more, but also demanding more, fasting longer, but punishing harsher. He surrounded himself with clergy who confirmed his divine mission, and whispered about enemies hiding in plain sight. Even as he rebuilt the city, he built walls around his trust. He spoke of love, but read lists of names late at night. He wept for his people, but kept poison close at hand. He kissed his wife's forehead, but ordered secret arrests at dawn. The young Tsar had tried to be the saviour Russia needed, but now he would become what Russia deserved, and those who had once seen a boy kissed by heaven would soon learn how easily angels fall. At first, the killings were whispered. They happened at night, quiet, selective, and wrapped in protocol. A boyar dismissed, a merchant jailed, A cousin poisoned during dinner. No trials, no confessions, only rumours that grew teeth. And Ivan? He prayed harder. By the early 1550s, Russia had begun its military expansion. Ivan's armies moved south and east, conquering the Khanates of Kazan, Niasatan, Sum, Kazan and Astrakhan. It was a holy war, he claimed, a crusade to unite the Orthodox world. But back in Moscow, his gaze turned inward. He began to speak of wolves in silk, noblemen with sweet tongues and black hearts, traitors who bowed in court and conspired in shadows. To others, they were his advisers. To Ivan, they were the same boyars who once let him starve in silence. Their faces may have changed, but in his mind they all wore the same mask. And so he began to test them. He invited nobles to feasts, then berated them publicly. He gifted estates, then seized them without warning. He asked questions with no right answers and judged them by hesitation. Fear crept into the Kremlin, room by room. Servants no longer whispered. They walked without making eye contact. Ministers stopped giving honest advice. Letters were burned unread. Then, in 1553, Ivan fell gravely ill. He collapsed with a high fever and drifted between life and death for weeks. On what was thought to be his deathbed, he asked the boyars to swear loyalty to his infant son Dmitri. They refused. Not all, but enough. Enough to reveal the truth he always suspected. They would rather Russia be rudderless than ruled by his blood. He recovered. His body healed. But his trust, already brittle, shattered completely. He began to draw lists, names, birthplaces, known associates. He sent spies into noble households disguised as monks. He recorded who laughed too long, who left early, who prayed without weeping. The boy who once watched his mother die without justice was now building a new justice, one rooted in revenge. By the late 1550s, executions became public. No longer hidden in the dark, they were staged with performance. A noble accused of treason would be led into Red Square, robes torn, head shaved, hands bound. A priest would read out his alleged crimes. Conspiracy, heresy, insult to the Khazar. Then the axe would fall, the body left to rot for a day, a reminder carved in bone. But not all of it was blood. Ivan still passed new laws. He built churches, he received foreign diplomats with grace and intelligence. Western visitors called him brilliant, cultured, even philosophical. Some compared him to Marcus Aurelius. Others feared him like Caligula, because under the crown 2 Ivans now lived, the scholar and the scourge, and which one you met depended on whether he saw you as a servant or a shadow. Those closest to him, including his beloved wife Anastasia, began to sense the war within him. She pleaded with him to trust again, to rest, to show mercy. But Ivan no longer believed in mercy. Mercy was what made kings weak, and he refused to be weak again. In the shadows of a golden throne, a new doctrine was forming. Fear was the only loyalty that could not be faked. And soon he would no longer simply react to betrayal. He would create it where none existed, just to justify the purge he was already planning. In 1564, Ivan IV disappeared. One winter morning, the court awoke to find the Kremlin silent and empty. The Tsar had left Moscow, fled, some said, vanished into the countryside with his loyal guards. Weeks passed. Whispers multiplied. Had he died? Had he gone mad? Then a letter arrived. Not a farewell. A declaration. In that letter, Ivan renounced the throne. He accused the boyars, clergy, and bureaucrats of corruption, betrayal, and theft. He claimed they had made it impossible for him to rule justly. He had not abdicated, he had abandoned them. The panic was immediate. The church begged him to return, the people wept in the streets. Noblemen, some of whom had plotted against him, sent desperate petitions, and then, like a puppet master satisfied with the tension in the strings, Ivan returned. But on one condition, he would rule with absolute unquestioned power, and to enforce that power he would create a new structure, the Oprichnina. This was no mere political faction. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, a secret police, a private army, and a death cult rolled into one. Their uniforms were black, their horses black, their saddles embroidered with brooms and dog heads, symbols of what they were sent to do: sniff out treason, sweep away filth. They operated above the law, outside the state. They answered only to Ivan, and they began the hunt. Whole provinces were declared opric. That meant the boyars who lived there were no longer protected by law. Their estates were seized, their servants tortured, their wives raped, their children disappeared. Those not executed outright were stripped of titles, forced into exile, or broken by interrogations designed not to find truth, but to spread fear. Torture became ritual. Victims were roasted alive in iron cages, fingernails torn out and replaced with needles. One noble was sewn inside a bear's skin and set upon by starving dogs. And all of it Ivan justified with scripture. He saw himself as God's chosen avenger, a sword forged in holy fire. To resist him was to resist divine order. He would fast for days, pray through the night, then sign a dozen death warrants before dawn. And every drop of blood spilled only seemed to strengthen his certainty. The oprichniki, for their part, embraced their role. Some were thugs, others were fanatics, but all of them basked in the Tsar's favour. They terrorized cities with impunity. They built their own courts, prisons, even their own churches. They mocked the old nobility and reshaped Russia's elite with blades and fire. And behind it all was Ivan, orchestrating, watching, judging. He did not trust anyone, but he trusted fear. Even Moscow, his capital, was not spared. People began to sleep with packed bags, not knowing if they'd be dragged from bed in the night. Churches held daily services for the souls of the accused, even when no one knew the names yet. But the oprichnina wasn't just about killing, it was about control. Control so absolute that people would rather accuse their neighbour than fall under suspicion themselves. It was about teaching Russia to bow, not just to a ruler, but to a god in human form, one who could save or destroy with equal ease. The boy once ignored in the Kremlin now had an empire trembling at every breath he took. And the man who once envied angels had finally become a devil of his own making. In the winter of 1570, the sky of Novgorod hung low and colourless as if the heavens themselves refused to witness what was coming. The bells of St. Sophia had not yet rung when the first riders arrived. Black-clad oprichniki, their horse hooves muffled by snow, their eyes as cold as the frozen earth. Behind them, Ivan the Terrible followed, not as a guest, but as a sword. He brought no court, no festival, no gifts. He brought death. Novgorod was one of Russia's oldest cities, a jewel of Orthodox piety, a vital trade hub, a proud place with an independent past. It had once dared to challenge Moscow's dominance, and now Ivan claimed to have proof. Letters, intercepted messengers, rumours whispered by spies. The charge? Treason. Allegiance to Poland and Lithuania. A plot to separate from his divine rule. The evidence? Still debated, likely fabricated. But Ivan needed no trial. He had judged them in his heart, and that was enough. The city would learn what it meant to be suspected by a god. For 5 straight weeks, Novgorod became a stage of slaughter. The city gates were sealed. No one allowed in, no one permitted out. The people, merchants, monks, mothers, children, were gathered in groups, their names read out loud, their homes marked with black crosses. Every day new screams tore through the streets. The oprichniki began with the church. Archbishop Pimen, once revered, was stripped of his robes and paraded through the square in a donkey cart, mocked and spat on. His priests were tied together and beaten to death with icons, the very relics they had sworn to protect. Next came the nobles, then the merchants, then anyone with enough bread to seem suspicious. Entire families were chained at the wrists and thrown into the frozen Volkhov River. Soldiers would break the ice, hurl the bodies in, and then watch to see who surfaced last. For sport. Infants were flung from city walls like broken dolls. Women were tied to sleighs and dragged until the snow turned red behind them. Some oprichniki sharpened their blades on church steps. Others got drunk and laughed as they skinned men alive, claiming it was penance. And Ivan? He watched. From a wooden platform built in the centre of the city, he observed the executions in silence. Occasionally he would mutter a prayer. Occasionally he would smile. There are accounts, still debated, that he took part himself, that he beat nobles with his iron staff, that he lit the torches used to burn monasteries, that he demanded mothers sing lullabies to their children before throwing them into the river. But even if those accounts are exaggerated, what is certain is this. He ordered it. He sustained it. He glorified it. The Volkhov River soon stopped flowing, clogged with frozen corpses. The city stank of rot. Wolves crept into the suburbs, no longer afraid of men. Survivors were forced to dig mass graves in the shape of crosses, their hands purple from frostbite. By the time Ivan and his oprichniki departed, up to 60,000 people were dead. The exact number? Lost to snow, mud, and a silence imposed by fear. What makes Novgorod more than just a massacre was its deliberate spectacle. This was not a rebellion crushed, not an army defeated. It was a city punished for a thought, a suspicion, a whisper, a rumour dressed as treason, and Ivan had turned that rumour into a religion. Even foreign diplomats recoiled. One English ambassador wrote, "Never has there been a land ruled so violently, where the blood of thousands became a garment for one man's paranoia." But to Ivan, this was justice, a necessary purge to cleanse Russia of rot, to teach the people that loyalty was not enough. Loyalty could still get you killed. Only fear could keep you alive. And as the Black Riders vanished over the snowy horizon, the message was clear. No city was safe, no soul untouchable, no sin sound too small to deserve annihilation. The massacre of Novgorod was not the end of Ivan's terror, it was his masterpiece. A frozen sermon preached in screams to a kingdom baptized in blood. After Novgorod there was no longer any doubt. Ivan was not just punishing traitors, he was remaking Russia in his image, city by city, bone by bone. But even monsters grow old, and even terror breeds resistance. Whispers began to spread among the remaining boyars, those nobles who had once been powerful, now reduced to trembling ornaments in the Tsar's palace. They had watched their peers vanish, their cousins executed, their estates burned, their wives silenced. Now they watched Ivan too, and they saw something new. Cracks. The Tsar had changed. His face, once filled with fury, now looked hollow. He began to speak to himself in public, mumbling prayers that no priest recognized. He would order executions one hour, then weep and send alms to monasteries the next. At times, he would lock himself in the palace for days, refusing food, bathing in ice water, claiming demons were whispering to him through the floorboards. Even the oprichniki, once loyal to the grave, had begun to fracture. Some drank themselves to madness. Others extorted bribes from terrified peasants. Their black uniforms had turned from symbols of obedience into badges of lawless cruelty. The machine Ivan built had begun to devour itself, and in that trembling space between madness and exhaustion, a dangerous thought was born among the boyars. What if the Tsar could fall? The first attempts at resistance weren't dramatic, they were surgical. A governor in Pskov refused an oprichnik order. A prince in Ryazan refused to deliver grain to the Tsar's court. Clergy in Rostov began to preach quietly, carefully, that no man, no matter how crowned, was above divine law. Then came the plot. In 1571, a group of high-ranking nobles secretly contacted Prince Vladimir of Stritsa, Ivan's cousin, and the last living male of the royal bloodline aside from Ivan's own sons. Vladimir had long lived under suspicion. He had been kept close but powerless, watched like a bird in a golden cage. He smiled when told to smile. He bowed when told to bow, but everyone knew. If Ivan died, Vladimir would be the next Tsar. The conspirators approached him in whispers. They promised safety, restoration, an end to the terror. And Vladimir, he hesitated, and that hesitation was all it took. Whether the plot was real, embellished, or entirely manufactured by Ivan is still debated. But the results were very real. The Tsar struck preemptively. In a single day, over 20 nobles were arrested. Some were beheaded in Red Square. Others were flayed alive. A few were boiled in vats of oil, their screams heard from the other side of the Moskva River. And Vladimir? He was forced to take the tonsure, to become a monk. His wife was drowned in secret. His children vanished into cells where the sun never reached. Ivan had turned his own bloodline into a graveyard. But not all opposition came from palaces. The church, once complicit, now cautious, began to resist in quiet defiance. Metropolitan Philip, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, publicly condemned the oprichnina. He called it unholy, un-Russian, un-Christian. He refused to bless Ivan's decrees. He demanded mercy for the people. He was arrested during Mass, dragged from the altar by oprichniki, stripped of his robes, beaten, and later strangled in prison. His body was buried in a shallow grave under snow. His only crime, speaking aloud what others feared to think. Outside Moscow, things fell apart. In 1571, the Crimean Tatars invaded. They burned the capital to the ground, killing over 80,000 civilians. The oprichniki failed to stop them. They were too busy hunting phantoms inside the empire to defend it from real enemies outside. For the first time, Ivan's terror had left Russia defenseless. His people began to lose faith, not just in his mercy, but in his power. His divine armor had cracked, and underneath they saw a man who had unleashed hell on his own soil while letting fire rain from foreign skies. The boyars did not rise again. They were broken. But so was the Tsar. The rebellion hadn't succeeded. It hadn't even begun fully. But it had exposed the truth. No throne rules forever, not even one drenched in blood. By the 1580s, the Tsar no longer looked like a man. He walked hunched, his spine bent as if crushed by invisible weights. His beard was wiry and stained, his skin, once pale, now blotched with sores and bruises, his eyes, sunken, bloodshot, haunted. Even the fourth, once crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia, now wandered the halls of the Kremlin like a ghost locked inside his own fortress. He mumbled to himself, he wept without warning. He struck walls when no one listened, and struck people when they did. The empire he ruled had shrunk, not in land, but in loyalty. The Oprichnina had been disbanded. The boyars no longer feared him, they endured him. Foreign powers mocked his weakness. His court avoided his gaze. His people prayed for peace, not justice, because justice had long since been buried, and still Ivan reigned. Because even a dying god can hold the throne, even a madman can carry a crown, if it's soaked in enough blood. Then came the final wound. In November 1581, Ivan entered the royal chambers and found his pregnant daughter-in-law Yelena dressed inappropriately by his standards, her clothing too revealing, her posture too relaxed. He accused her of immodesty. She bowed, she begged, and he beat her, violently with his own hands. Days later she miscarried. When Ivan's eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, his heir, his namesake, heard what had happened, he confronted his father. Eyewitnesses say the prince shouted at the Tsar in full view of the court that he accused him of madness, cruelty, and destroying his own bloodline. Ivan, already trembling with rage, raised his staff, a heavy iron rod more symbol than weapon, but this time he used it. He struck his son across the head. Once, twice, the blow cracked the prince's skull, blood pooled on the marble floor. Realizing what he had done, Ivan fell to his knees, cradled the broken body and sobbed uncontrollably. He cried for hours. He screamed for priests, for physicians, for forgiveness. But it was too late. The Tsarevich died a few days later. That single act, a father killing his heir, became the moment Ivan could never escape. Russia would never be the same. The boyars saw it as the ultimate proof of madness. The church saw it as the wrath of God turned inward. The people saw it as a curse placed on the dynasty, and Ivan, he saw it everywhere. He began painting the scene over and over again. One icon, known as Ivan and his son, survives to this day. In it he holds the prince's limp body, eyes wide with horror, a father devoured by his own violence. But this was not redemption. He did not abdicate. He did not repent. He merely slowed down, like a storm that has run out of thunder but still floods the land. The final years were filled with shadows. Ivan secluded himself in the Kremlin, surrounded by alchemists, astrologers, and fools. He drank potions to ward off death. He obsessed over relics, bones of saints, cursed manuscripts. He read omens in spilled wax and birds that flew the wrong direction. He changed rooms every night, convinced assassins lurked in the walls. He trusted no one. He poisoned his own food before eating it. He slept beside loaded weapons, and yet the thing he feared most was his own soul. Some nights he would order monks to chant prayers for the dead, his victims named one by one from lists that filled entire scrolls. Other nights he wandered the catacombs beneath Moscow whispering to skeletons. When he did appear in public, he was draped in black, his hands trembling, his mouth muttering psalms, not for mercy but to drown out the screams in his mind. Russia had become a kingdom of ghosts, and its ruler was the loudest among them. Ivan IV died on March 28, 1584, while playing a game of chess. His body slumped forward onto the board. The room fell silent. No one moved, no one dared. There was no riot, no mourning crowds, just relief, quiet, unspoken, dangerous relief. The man who had crowned himself as God's wrath on earth had finally been defeated, not by sword, not by man, but by his own blood-soaked legacy. When Ivan IV died in 1584, no monument was raised. No songs were sung, no church bells rang for the man who claimed to be the chosen sword of God. The Kremlin buried him in a tomb near his sons, wrapped in royal cloth, beneath cold stone. But what Russia did next was not mourning, it was erasure. The man who had ruled for over 50 years, who expanded the empire, reformed the church, codified the law, terrorized the nobility, and murdered his own heir, was suddenly a problem that history needed to solve. He was too infamous to be ignored, too complex to be praised, too bloody to be remembered fully. And so, he was broken into pieces. The Orthodox Church canonized his enemies, not him. St. Philip, the bishop Ivan had strangled in prison, became a holy martyr. Cathedrals bore his name. His sermons were copied by hand and passed in whispers, reminders that righteousness could still exist even in the face of tyranny. The boyars who survived rewrote the chronicles. Ivan was no longer Tsar and father, he was Grozny. Terrible, cursed, unbalanced. The Oprichnina, described as a dark experiment, a mistake, a fever dream. Some scholars went further. They claimed he had not truly ruled for years, that his ministers made the decisions, that his madness made him irrelevant, but that was a lie. Ivan may have descended into madness, but he ruled until his final breath. He signed decrees, he sentenced men to die, he chose the war campaigns. The blood was not a shadow behind the throne, it was the hand on the throne itself. In the following decades, Russia paid the price for his legacy. With Ivan's son murdered and his youngest too weak to lead, the empire fell into chaos. A crisis of succession followed, famines, impostors, civil wars. The period became known as the Time of Troubles. Foreign armies marched through Russian soil. Pretenders claimed the throne. The Romanovs would not rise until decades later, and even when they did, they distanced themselves from Ivan's name, calling him necessary but dangerous. He was the past they feared, not the future they desired, and yet they could never quite bury him. Ivan's image lingered in strange places. Peasant folklore began to depict him as a trickster king, cruel but wise, like an old wolf guarding his den. Painters portrayed him in long robes, holding a staff, one hand raised in blessing, the other in threat. Children whispered of him at night, a bogeyman with a crown who had come for the disobedient, and in the deepest corners of power a quiet admiration remained, not for his brutality, but for his control. He had ruled alone, he had crushed rebellion, he had made the throne unchallengeable, and that was a fantasy many rulers found impossible to resist. Centuries later, during the rise of the Soviet Union, Stalin himself ordered historians to reconsider Ivan, not as a tyrant, but as a misunderstood genius, a national unifier, a visionary ahead of his time. Textbooks were rewritten, monuments appeared again. The old justifications returned. He had to be harsh. Russia was surrounded by enemies. He ruled as the times demanded. What Stalin saw in Ivan was not madness. It was method, a blueprint for iron-fisted rule, a model for shaping history by fear and making it forget what it once knew. Even today, Russia remains divided over Ivan IV. Some call him a monster, others a necessary evil, a few still call him great. Statues have been proposed and torn down. His name appears in schoolbooks, but sanitized. A list of victories, a footnote of crimes. The man who drowned a city in blood, who turned faith into a weapon and silence into policy, was not forgotten because he was unworthy of memory. He was forgotten because he made memory itself dangerous. He blurred the line between justice and vengeance, power and punishment, loyalty and fear, so deeply that even centuries later we struggle to tell them apart. There is a silence that comes after blood has dried, not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion, of a people who have cried too long to cry again, of an empire too ashamed to speak of its own maker. Ivan IV, Tsar of all Russia, was not the first man to rule by fear, and he would not be the last. But he was the first in Russian history to make terror a system, to design loyalty as a weapon, and to believe, fully, absolutely, that only through suffering could a nation be made whole. And that belief, however twisted, was contagious. He began as a child unwanted. He was raised by shadows, kicked by courtiers, ignored by priests. He read about God's wrath and decided it was a language he could speak better than love. He crowned himself with holiness, then killed in the name of it. And still, to this day, there are those who ask, was he mad? Or merely methodical? Was he evil? Or simply necessary? But maybe those are the wrong questions. Maybe the real question is, why do we keep building systems that allow men like him to exist? Ivan was not alone. He had executioners. He had scribes who wrote down the names. He had soldiers who swung the blades. He had priests who said the prayers. He had nobles who stayed silent. No one stopped him, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid to be next. And in that silence he grew stronger. Tyranny does not appear overnight. It is watered by fear, fertilized by obedience, and harvested by those who look away just long enough. History likes to label men like Ivan with a single word: terrible. As if that's enough. As if we can wrap horror in 4 syllables and move on. But that terrible doesn't explain how a city of 60,000 people could be drowned by one man's suspicion. It doesn't explain how a father could cradle his dying son and still die believing he was right. It doesn't explain why his tomb still stands, or why some still bring flowers. So who was he really? A ruler? A tyrant? A father who lost too much? A boy who never stopped bleeding? Or maybe he was a mirror. Not a god, not of destiny, but of us, of what happens when we choose silence over resistance, when we mistake cruelty for strength. When we let a crown excuse a crime again and again, even the terrible is dead, but the idea of him isn't. It lingers in rooms where decisions are made in secret, in cities where fear moves faster than justice, in nations where truth is buried because it's too inconvenient. So let me ask you, if you're still listening, when the next Ivan stands before the river, staff in hand, judgment in his eyes, will you call him terrible, or will you call him necessary? Will you raise your voice, or will you do what they did in Novgorod? Lower your eyes, hold your breath, and hope the ice holds.